And the Quran, in its revelation, weaves together different aspects of life. It presents the stories of humanity. It presents instruction, or what you would like to say, law. It presents arguments from natural phenomenon for the existence of God. It presents arguments from human nature. It presents arguments from reason and from logic, and maybe those dominate the Quran. But it weaves together all the various aspects of life, weaves them together to point to a single, what the Quran considers supreme fact, that your Lord, your God, is one. It doesn't separate these things I mentioned into separate chapters. Just as these things are interwoven throughout our lives, they are interwoven throughout the Quran. So the Quran was definitely not a history, but it does report stories. Stories about humanity, narratives, parables about human beings and human nature. And I would like to talk about that for a little bit, because for me that created something of a curiosity. Though the Quran contains stories, most of the stories in it are about prophets of old, or pious persons of old, or sometimes it even involves people who led bad lives and ultimately went to their self-destruction. Although it contains these stories, an interesting aspect about it is that it contains no chronology, no dates, no historical landmarks, nothing like that. And you have to realize that when I was reading the Quran, I was keeping my eye open for such types of things. I was looking for anachronisms. I was expecting that there would be some sort of historical contradictions. Because ultimately, you find those in every scripture. Not that I would thought it would mean very much. I was mostly interested in the purpose of life. I wasn't going to discard the scripture for that reason. And plus, my way of thinking about Revelation was not really at that time a sort of Muslim way of thinking about it, where Muslims believe that God is speaking through the Quran directly through Muhammad, the prophet, to humanity, a direct address. So that wouldn't have really discouraged me, but I kept my eye open nonetheless, just out of curiosity. And as I went through the Quran, I could find, first of all, nothing that would contradict history, or a historical, that would be subject, I would say, to historical criticism. Because as I said, it has no historical reference points. It's not anchored in history. It has many stories in the Quran. Sometimes they begin in one surah, parts of it will be picked up in another surah. Is it hot in here tonight? It feels hot to me. Part of it will be picked up later on. But still, so it has a few continuous narratives, but many of these are not. But regardless of that fact, it's impossible to place these accounts in the Quran in history without consulting outside sources. So it gives the stories sort of a transcendent feel. Like it's easy to place yourself in the position of the characters in the stories, because all the historical reference points, all the superficial details are stripped away, and the stories are told in such a way they just get to the moral or spiritual point. The interesting thing about it, though, is that if you look at the Quran, it's very often not clear if a story that's being told is being presented as history, whether it's being presented as a parable, a symbolic story, whether it's being presented as a very popular legend, which the Quran is recasting to teach the Arabs, who, for them, these legends were everything that they used to recite at their annual trade fairs. Whether it's recasting them to bring out a moral point, because it's certainly referring to stories that they know well. It's not, and sometimes it's not clear whether even when it's telling a story, it's a merger of these. The author seems purposely ambiguous on the point. And last night I told you we got into a discussion about the story of Adam. Is that relating to the historical origins of Homo sapiens? Or is it an allegory? And some Quranic scholars thought it was an allegory. Others thought it was, ancient scholars thought it was history. But the point is that, and there are internal details that lead you to believe one or the other, but for me at least, it wasn't clear. And the same could be said for so many of the accounts in the Quran. The story of Luqman, for example. Again, it was difficult, not Luqman, Dhul Qarnayn, the prophet conqueror, who conquered from the west to the very east of this planet. Journeyed west to the farthest point, east to the farthest point. The prophet conqueror. The Muslims have never been able to really identify him with any historical personality. Some identified him with Alexander the Great, but we all know Alexander the Great was a polytheist. It's a historical fact, and Dhul Qarnayn is presented as a strict monotheist. So the point was the Quran recasting a famous legend that the people understood to teach them a moral, ethical point and spiritual point, teach them moral, spiritual lessons, or was it history? I'm not arguing with anybody how you relate to this. I'm just saying, for me, it was not clear. And it seemed to me that the author was being purposely ambiguous at that point. By not including explicit temporal references, it seemed that he was not seemed like he was avoiding, contradicting the beliefs, the assumptions of his initial audience, for whom history, legend, poem, etc. were interwoven and merged, and at the same time avoiding conflicting with the reason and thinking of a people of a much later time who were very critical about such distinctions. Whatever the case may be, as much as I wanted to find some way to historically criticize the Quran, from a rational standpoint, I could find no rational justification. There just wasn't enough there to criticize it from a historical standpoint. And that intrigued me, because I thought, why? If this man was the author, the man whom I assumed it was, Muhammad, why would he omit historical reference points? Purposely, because it's done throughout the entire Quran. Why would he omit them? Certainly when the Arabs told these stories, and it was clear from the Quran that they were familiar with many of them, at least somewhat, they had such historical reference points. Certainly they wouldn't have minded if they were included. They didn't have it in their mentality at that point to resort to historical criticism. Why would he avoid that? Why would he avoid it throughout the Quran? It started to open up a question for me. This author almost seemed to have an eye to the future when he wrote the Quran, whom I assumed was Muhammad, and I thought as he wrote the Quran. It was just a question.